Hello and welcome to the Genuine Learning Blog. My name is Melissa Galasso, and today we're going to talk about a proposal from the GASB. So we're going to talk about compensated absences. Now, obviously, GASB already has guidance on compensated absences, but they're planning to handle some diversity in practice, some common deficiencies. In fact, some of the most common GFOA findings are related to presentation of compensated absences, gross versus net, what's shown in 1 year. We see a lot of times where this is one of the big issues in presentation, and then just some differences between current treatment of sick time versus vacation time and how that impacted the accrual. So let's take a look here. So this proposal was issued in February 2021. Comments are due June 4th. Now, as I mentioned, one of the big background reasons for this is that current guidance has a distinction in GASB 16 between vacation and sick leave. However, over the last decade or so, I know for me, I've always had paid time off. Right. So paid time off, it doesn't matter if you're sick or if you're going on vacation, you can use the time however you would like. And so this concept of PTO has created some complications in there. In addition, it doesn't really address compensatory time when someone is given additional time off in lieu of something like overtime pay, not really addressed in the accident standard. And then the options, so a lack of consistency. Statement 16 allows for two different methods for your sick time, termination method or vesting method. And so that leads to diversity in practice. And so they decided to go back through here and try to streamline, make it more consistent, address some of those common deficiencies. So when we're talking about compensated absences, they do give us a definition here. So it's leave that employee uses for time off with pay. So you'll notice here that it's a little bit more broad in terms of definition. It's leave for which employees receive payment upon termination of employment. So they use this concept of termination of employment pretty frequently. They do clarify that it could be for any reason, including voluntary resignation or retirement. So that is something that they do clarify in the standard. And then leave for which employees receive settlement through other means, such as conversion to post-employment benefits. So when we think about this, this is the definition. They go on to talk about that doesn't have a set payment schedule. It could be vacation, sick, PTO, holidays, parental leave, bereavement leave, and certain sabbatical. And we'll talk about which sabbaticals qualify for compensated absences. So in terms of what's the treatment going to be, it's a recognition here based on again, this is for the economic resource measurement focus. We're going to recognize a liability if the absence accumulates. And so that's something that could be carried forward to a future period. So if it's use it or lose it, right, then the absence does not accumulate. So it has to be something that you can carry forward. And if you don't use it, it goes again to the next year and it continues to grow. And some people, when they retire, have quite a bit of accrued vacation or accrued sick time that haven't been used. The absence is attributed to services rendered. So again, this has already happened, past service. The absences, and here's that term, more likely than not to be either paid or settled through other means. And so when we think about this, it's going to depend. This is where we have to look at the government's policies. We have to look at, are there different roles for different classes of employees? What is some of the historical information about how this payment has happened? And so accumulated leave that is more likely than not to be settled through conversion to defined benefit post-employment benefits are not going to be included in the compensated absence liability. We'll talk about the location of that in a little bit. So when we look at this, that's the concept of the recognition. So we put a liability on the books when it accumulates, when it's for past service that's already been rendered, and it's more likely than not to either be paid out or settled, right? So that, at retirement or when they resign, right, it's going to be paid out or it's going to be settled in some manner. So what is the consistency here? Again, in terms of measurement, they're trying to make this a little bit easier, but also more consistent. So a calculation of accumulated leave, so number of hours that you have accumulated, multiplied by the employee's pay rate as of the financial reporting date. So there's a lot of discussion in the basis for conclusions about cost-benefit analysis, and one thing that they tried to do is simplify. We know how much the person is making at that date. We don't know when they're going to retire or when they're going to quit and what their pay rate is going to be. And so instead of thinking, about pensions is a great example. We have this prediction element. We're not going to do that. We're going to try to still keep this as simple as possible. So any changes to the measurement of liability due to changes in pay rate are recognized in the period of the change. So we're going to catch it up. At that point, we're not going to ask you to predict on the creation of liability. However, for every rule, we're going to have an exception or sometimes multiple exceptions. And so here, if accumulated leave is more likely than not to be paid at a rate different from the employee's pay rate at time of payment, and the example here is very specific. So unused leave is paid at 1/2 of the pay rate. So in that scenario, then you would use the appropriate rate. But you're not saying, we're not contradicting the original one, which is if it's based on the actual pay rate, then you would use the financial reporting date. So this is only saying if there's some calculation that's going to impact it, that then you would not, you would want to use that calculation based on that financial reporting date. The other exception here is if it's going to be more likely than not settled through some means other than conversion to a defined benefit post-employment benefit, it should be measured at the amount for which the liability is more likely than not to be settled. So when we look at the grouping here, so more likely than not to be settled through some means other than conversion to a defined benefit post-employment benefit. The other thing to reduce diversity in practice is that they're going to require the first in, first out method. So obviously, when you first get hired by the government, that is when you are going to be paid typically the least. And then as you work your way up the ladder, typically people get paid more. The problem comes when you're using current dollars, right? We have the issue, well, the accumulation could be from as early as their first year. And so the first in, first out when estimating the compensated liability that's due within 1 year. So that way it's based on that element of it. In terms of measurement, you should include in compensated absences what they call salary-related payments. So this is a very interesting one, and they have to be directly and incrementally associated with payments or settlements made. So inside of the compensated absences, when we think about salary related, the definition here are additional obligations that a government incurs related to pay an employee for services rendered. And so the example, Social Security taxes, the employer portion of Medicare, right? So when we look at this, while it's using the term salary related, it doesn't matter if it's hourly or salaried employee, but if you're going to have these other taxes that are going to come due, those should be included in the obligation when we're calculating them. However, another exception is that if it's related to defined contribution pension or defined contribution OPEB that are directly and incrementally associated, then they should be recognized in the pension or OPEB expense and then booked into the pension or OPEB liability rather than the compensated absences. However, the second item here, if it's related to defined benefit, they're not included in the compensated balance at all. And then last but not least, the sabbatical. So this one is where they're trying to decide whether the sabbatical is inside of that definition of a compensated absence. And it depends on what the employee is doing. If they're taking a sabbatical just a year off and they have no work requirement, then that is a compensated absence. If they're doing a sabbatical, so say it's a university, a public university, and they're going to take a sabbatical from teaching to work on their research, well, then that's not going to be a sabbatical for compensated absences. So sabbatical leave meets the criteria for recognition as a compensated absence liability if an employee is not required to perform any significant duties for the government during the sabbatical, right? So unrestricted. They are taking a year off. If they're required to perform duties of a different nature, research instead of teaching, then that's not a compensated absence. They're just not, they're not keeping up their teaching schedule, but they still have, some job that they're doing for the government. In that scenario, that's not a compensated absence. So they do clarify what's within the scope here. All right, so that's a wrap on compensated absences. Again, GASB would love to hear from you, trying to reduce diversity in practice, reduce some of the issues that we're seeing from GFOA in terms of common deficiencies and, in incorrect presentation. So hopefully this will help, but I'm sure they would love to hear from you, your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope to see you on a future blog. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.